It was just after 2 in the morning when the world around Daniel Turner and his wife Sarah shattered in an instant. The night had been peaceful, the kind that made the small suburban street seem like a slice of heaven. The rain had stopped an hour earlier, leaving the air cold and still. Inside the little blue house, the faint hum of a generator in the backyard was the only sound. Daniel was out there, tightening bolts and checking wiring, trying to make sure it would last another winter. Inside, Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket over her legs, a mug of tea half finished beside her. The TV played softly in the background, a commercial about home insurance flickering across the screen. It was an ordinary night, the kind of night that fools you into believing bad things only happen to other people. But peace never lasts forever. Without warning, a loud crash broke the stillness. The sound of a door being torn from its hinges echoed through the house. Sarah's eyes shot open, heart pounding in her chest. For a second, she thought it was Daniel coming in from the backyard. But then she heard shouting. Men's voices, sharp and commanding, shouting words that didn't make sense in her sleepy mind. Police! Get down! Get down now! Her pulse spiked, confusion replacing sleep. She stumbled up, clutching her phone. Wait! What? Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling, her mind unable to catch up with the chaos around her. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and she took a hesitant step toward the hallway, unaware that her life was about to end in a flash of light. Outside, the night erupted in flashing blue and red. 3 police cruisers were parked across the lawn, their engines still running, lights painting the neighborhood in panic. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering to each other, their faces pale in the glow. They didn't know who lived there. Not really. The Turners kept to themselves, quiet, polite, always paying their dues on time. No one could imagine what crime the police thought was happening inside that house. Inside, the officers moved fast, their adrenaline high, their weapons raised. They had been told this was a dangerous situation. Armed suspects, possible drug activity, potential hostages. Their briefing had been rushed, the address hastily confirmed. None of them expected to see a small, cozy living room with family photos on the wall, a golden retriever curled on a rug, and the faint smell of cinnamon tea. But fear and training overrode doubt. They moved through the door like a storm, flashlights cutting through the dark, boots stomping across the floor. One officer yelled again, "Police! Drop it!" The sound of Sarah's frightened gasp echoed back. She stood in the hall, her phone still in her hand, her other hand raised slightly as if to calm whoever was shouting. "I'm just calling my husband," she said, her voice shaking. But in that second, the beam of a flashlight caught the reflection of her phone's metal edge. A nervous young officer at the back mistook it for a weapon. His finger tightened on the trigger before his mind could stop him. One deafening shot cracked the night open. The sound tore through the house like thunder. Sarah's phone fell to the ground with a sharp clatter, and her body followed, collapsing onto the hallway floor. Daniel heard it. From the backyard, the echo of the gunfire froze him in place. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then instinct took over. He ran. The generator tools fell from his hands, clanging on the concrete as he sprinted toward the house. His boots splashed through a puddle. He burst through the back door just as the officers rushed forward inside. The scene that met him didn't seem real. The blinding lights, the smell of gunpowder, the shouting voices, and Sarah lying motionless on the wooden floor. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands instantly finding the wound near her chest. Warm blood seeped between his fingers, and his breath came out in a broken gasp. "Hold on, baby," he whispered, his voice low, shaking. "I've got you. Just hold on." He pressed harder, ignoring the pain in his chest, ignoring the officers yelling behind him to stay back. They didn't understand that when a man like Daniel heard those words, "Stay back," he didn't listen. He'd heard those same words on battlefields long before this quiet neighborhood ever existed. His eyes, once kind and calm, turned sharp and focused. The same eyes that had once guided men through storms, through fire, through chaos. The officers froze for a moment when they saw him. There was something about his posture, something about how steady his hands were as he tried to save her. It wasn't panic, it was control, the kind that only comes from years of facing the worst. Paramedics were called. One of the officers tried to explain, stammering about a mistake, about a miscommunication, about how they thought they were breaking into a different house. But Daniel didn't hear a word. His focus was Sarah, her breathing shallow, her lips pale. He looked into her eyes, saw the fear, the confusion, the pain. "You're going to be fine," he whispered again, though a part of him knew he was lying. The paramedics arrived minutes later, but to Daniel, it felt like hours. They pulled him back, forced him to let go, and for the first time, his blooded hands trembled. He watched as they worked on her, their voices urgent, their movements fast but not fast enough. They lifted her onto the stretcher, the sound of the heart monitor filling the room. One of the officers reached out, trying to apologize, but Daniel just stared at him with eyes that could freeze fire. As the ambulance doors closed, the street filled with murmurs and flashing lights. The neighbors stood in clusters, their faces full of horror. Daniel climbed into his truck, his clothes soaked in blood. He didn't drive to the hospital right away. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard, feeling his pulse thundering in his ears. He could still hear the echo of the shot. He could still see Sarah falling. Something inside him shifted, something deep and irreversible. He wasn't just a man in pain anymore. He was something else, something the world had forgotten to fear. At the hospital, they told him she was in surgery. They told him to wait. He sat in the waiting area, his hands still red, his face blank. Hours passed. A detective came to ask questions, his voice careful, rehearsed. "Mr. Turner, we need to know what happened before the officers entered." Daniel didn't answer. He just looked at the man, his expression calm but unreadable. The detective shifted uneasily, glancing at Daniel's hands. There was something unsettling about the way he sat there, so still, so quiet. When dawn finally came, the doctor approached. His face said everything before his words did. "We did everything we could." The rest faded into noise. Daniel didn't react. He didn't shout, didn't cry. He just nodded slowly. Then he stood up, walked out of the hospital, and disappeared into the morning fog. The detective watched him go, a chill running down his spine. He didn't know that Daniel Turner wasn't just a husband. He was a former Navy operative, a man who once commanded missions so classified they didn't even exist on paper. A man who had sworn never to return to that life. But now, the past was awake. Back at the house, the sun rose over shattered glass and bloodstains. Police tape fluttered in the wind. Inside, a photo of Daniel and Sarah on their wedding day lay face down on the floor. A bullet hole marked the wall behind it. The officers who had been there that night couldn't sleep. The young one who fired the shot sat in his car until sunrise, shaking uncontrollably, replaying the moment in his head. He didn't know what haunted him more, the sound of the gunshot or the look in Daniel's eyes when he saw what they had done. Later that day, Daniel returned home. The street was quiet again, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. He walked through the wreckage without emotion, picking up the photo frame, dusting it off. He placed it upright on the shelf, then sat down at the kitchen table. His hands rested flat on the surface. His mind replayed everything. The sirens, the shouting, the shot, Sarah's eyes. The anger wasn't loud. It wasn't fiery. It was cold, measured, and steady. He had been trained to react that way, to feel nothing until the mission was complete. As night fell again, Daniel went into the garage. He opened an old wooden chest tucked beneath the workbench. Inside were remnants of a life he had buried long ago. A worn-out Navy patch, a black notebook, a compass, and a steel badge engraved with the emblem of his old unit, SEAL Team Spectre. He traced the outline of the emblem with his finger, remembering the men he had led, the vows they had taken, the lines they had crossed for the sake of justice. He remembered one phrase they all lived by: "We end what others start." Daniel looked at the photo of Sarah one more time, the one of her laughing on the beach years ago. Then he closed his eyes and whispered, You didn't deserve this. None of it. When he opened them again, there was no trace of the quiet man who used to fix neighbors' fences or wave politely at the mailman. In his place was someone else, someone the police would soon wish they had never met. The house was still, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was alive with a quiet kind of energy, the kind that comes before action. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of a distant siren, echoing through the empty street. The neighbors, who had spent the day whispering rumors and praying for peace, didn't know that peace had already left. What was coming now wasn't noise or chaos. It was silence, controlled, deliberate, and unstoppable. And as Daniel turned off the lights and sat in the dark, staring at the floor where Sarah had fallen, he didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply waited. Because he knew one thing better than anyone. The ones who made this mistake thought they could hide behind procedures, paperwork, and excuses. But they didn't know who they had woken up that night. They didn't know that the man who lost everything was the same man who once led missions no one dared to speak of. They didn't know that behind his quiet eyes was a storm years in the making. They didn't know that their mistake didn't just take a life. It revived something far more dangerous. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the blinds, Daniel whispered to the empty room, "This isn't over." The next morning, the little blue house stood quiet under a pale gray sky. The neighborhood was still, but the silence wasn't peace, it was fear. Yellow police tape fluttered weakly in the cold wind, and the wet asphalt still glistened under the flashing remnants of red and blue lights. Reporters had gathered by the end of the street, whispering, pointing their cameras toward the house that had become the latest headline. The sign in the front yard still read "Welcome Home" in faded paint, but now it looked cruel, almost mocking. Inside the house, every wall carried the weight of what had happened. The front door was splintered, the hallway marked by a single bullet hole, and the faint metallic smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Daniel Turner sat alone on the couch, hands resting on his knees, his face blank. He had returned from the hospital hours ago, after the doctor's quiet apology and the soft words that meant his wife would never come home again. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't spoken a single word since. The police had tried to question him, but all he offered were short nods and hollow stares. They thought he was in shock, but they were wrong. Daniel wasn't numb, he was calculating. Every sound, every word, every movement from that night replayed in his mind in perfect detail. The officers' positions, their voices, the timing between the crash and the shot. It was as if his mind had recorded everything. That kind of memory wasn't normal, it was trained. It was the kind that came from years of command under pressure, from nights where one wrong move meant death. The department released a statement that morning calling it a tragic accident during a high-risk operation. They said the officers had acted on credible intelligence. They said it was a miscommunication. They said everything except the truth. But Daniel knew better. He watched the police chief's press conference on the small TV in the corner, his jaw tightening with each word. The chief spoke like a man trying to build a wall of words high enough to hide behind. But Daniel had built and torn down walls like that before, in deserts, in jungles, in boardrooms full of men who thought power could cover guilt. He turned off the TV and stood slowly. His body felt heavy, but his mind was sharp. He walked to the bedroom, where Sarah's things were still untouched. Her slippers were by the bed, her sweater draped over the chair, and a half-read book lay open on the nightstand. The sight of those small, ordinary things hit harder than the blood or the noise or the grief. It was as if time had frozen in the moment before the world broke. Daniel picked up her sweater and pressed it to his face, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume, lavender and soap. For the first time since that night, his eyes closed. Not to cry, but to remember. The knock on the door came softly at first, then louder. When Daniel opened it, a detective stood there, a tall man with tired eyes and a notepad in his hand. His name was Detective Rowan. He spoke gently, like a man walking through a field of landmines. "Mr. Turner, I'm very sorry for your loss," he began. "We're doing everything we can to investigate this properly. There'll be a full inquiry." Daniel didn't answer. The detective shifted awkwardly. "If you could just tell us anything, Anything you remember from last night. It would help. Daniel's voice, when it finally came, was quiet but steady. You already have what you need. Rowan frowned. So? Daniel's eyes didn't move from his. Your body cams. Your radios. Your warrant logs. You already know what went wrong. The detective swallowed, unsure how to respond. There was something unnerving about how calm this man was, how certain. We're still reviewing, he started, but Daniel cut him off. Don't waste time pretending you're looking for answers. You're looking for a way to protect yourselves. The detective didn't argue. He simply nodded, wrote something down, and left. But as he walked back to his car, he felt the hair on his neck stand up. Something about Daniel Turner didn't feel like grief. It felt like silence before a storm. That afternoon, the neighborhood gossip spread like fire. Some said Daniel had been a soldier. Others said he worked for the government. No one really knew the truth. He had moved there just 5 years ago. Quiet, polite, always fixing something in his yard, never causing trouble. The HOA president, Greg Wallace, had always complained about him. Said his shed was an eyesore, said his security cameras were unnecessary, said his generator was too loud. Petty things that now seemed meaningless. But Greg had been the one who called the non-emergency line weeks ago, complaining about strange activity around Daniel's home. That report had been passed along, forwarded, and somehow landed on a police desk marked potential narcotics activity. A clerical error. A misread code. A single mistake that sent a team of armed men to the wrong house at 2 in the morning. But Daniel didn't know all that yet. All he knew was that his wife was gone and no one was taking responsibility. He spent the rest of that day in his garage, not touching tools, just sitting beside the old wooden trunk that had followed him through every base, every deployment, every chapter of his hidden life. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were things that didn't belong to a simple homeowner: encrypted drives, tactical gear, a steel wristwatch engraved with coordinates, and a black patch stitched with a silver skull and wings. Underneath it all was a sealed envelope marked Turner, D. Spectre Ops. He stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling slightly. Then he set it aside. Not yet. As the sun went down, the house grew darker, quieter. The silence was unbearable, but Daniel didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the sound of his own heartbeat slowing. He wasn't thinking about vengeance. Not yet. He was thinking about patterns, about procedure, about how easily one mistake could destroy everything. But deep inside him, something old was stirring. Something trained to act when justice failed. That night, he drove to the hospital. Not to see anyone, Sarah was gone, but to walk the halls she had been taken through. The nurse at the desk recognized him and froze, unsure what to say. Daniel simply nodded to her, his face blank, and walked down the corridor until he reached the trauma wing. The smell of antiseptic burned his throat. He stopped at the door marked Operating Room 3. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the handle, remembering how they had rushed her through it, her hand slipping from his. When he finally walked away, a single tear rolled down his cheek. It was the only one. By the time he returned home, it was past midnight. The street was empty except for one car parked near the corner, an unmarked sedan. Inside, 2 officers sat watching the house. They were told to keep an eye on him for safety reasons. But Daniel saw them. He always saw everything. As he closed his front door, his lips tightened. If they thought he was unpredictable, they were right. But not in the way they feared. In the days that followed, the world moved on. News stations stopped running the story. The police department promised an internal review. The HOA tried to hold a meeting to reassure the community. But Daniel didn't attend. He didn't answer calls. He didn't open the door when neighbors brought food. He was a ghost, haunting his own house. Yet behind that silence, he was moving. Every night, the faint glow of a computer screen filled his study. He was pulling files, names, dates, frequencies, things no ordinary civilian should have access to. He was piecing together a timeline. He wanted to know how a false report became a raid. He wanted to know who signed the papers, who approved the address, who ignored the checks. And with each answer he found, another question appeared. 3 nights later, he received an anonymous email. No subject, no name, just a single line, "You were not supposed to be the target." Attached was a police log, redacted, incomplete, but real. It confirmed what Daniel suspected. The warrant had been meant for a house 2 streets over. The officer who filed it had mixed up the address. The department had tried to bury it immediately. Daniel stared at the screen for a long time, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. Then, slowly, he smiled, a small, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. He printed the document and pinned it to the wall of his study. Then he added another beside it, a map of the neighborhood, marking each officer's position, the timing of their arrival, their badge numbers. He drew connecting lines, arrows, notes, an entire operation built in reverse. He wasn't just investigating anymore. He was preparing. Days later, Detective Rowan returned, looking more nervous than before. He said the department was offering a settlement, an official apology, money, a press statement. Daniel listened quietly. Then he asked one question. Will they face charges? Rowan hesitated. It's complicated, he said softly. Internal review, you know how these things. Daniel stood up, his shadow falling across the detective. You're right, he said. I do know how these things work. That night, Daniel opened the wooden chest again. He lifted the envelope marked Spectre Ops and broke the seal. Inside were pages filled with call signs, encrypted frequencies, and names that had once been erased from official records. He found what he was looking for, a contact written in code. It wasn't a name, just a phrase, "The anchor still holds." It was a signal, one that only a handful of men in the world would recognize. He powered on an old encrypted radio and transmitted the phrase once, then sat back. Hours passed. Then, at 3:27 a.m., the radio crackled with static. A familiar voice came through, gravelly, low, controlled. Reaper 1. Is that you? Daniel's eyes closed. It had been years since anyone had called him that. He pressed the button. It's me, he said. I need information. The voice hesitated. You're not active anymore. You know the rules. Daniel's tone was calm, steady. I don't follow rules anymore. Silence. Then the voice returned. Understood. What do you need? When the call ended, Daniel sat quietly for a long time. The line between the man he had been and the man he was becoming had disappeared. The investigation wasn't over. The review wasn't enough. The apology meant nothing. The men who came into his house would face him, not the Navy officer, not the civilian, but the ghost of Reaper 1, the man who led missions no one survived unless he wanted them to. By morning, Daniel stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in pale orange. To anyone else, he looked like a grieving widower staring into space. But inside, the storm had begun. The man behind the silence was awake again, and the ones who thought the story was over had no idea that it was only beginning. The next few nights passed like ghosts through the Turner house, each one colder than the last. The rain had returned, tapping gently on the broken windows as if reminding the walls of the violence they had witnessed. The house sat quiet on the corner, but inside, it was no longer a home, it was a command post. The living room that once held laughter and soft music was now lined with papers, maps, photographs, and notes pinned in perfect order. On the center table sat Daniel's old laptop, connected to a maze of encrypted networks. Lines of code flickered across the screen, tracing communications between local precincts, radio channels, and dispatch calls. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was hunting. He had spent years teaching others how to track men who didn't want to be found. Now, he turned those same methods inward, using them to find the truth that the department was hiding. He moved without sound, without hesitation, his face lit by the soft glow of the monitor. Every keystroke, every click was deliberate. He didn't drink, didn't eat much, and barely slept. He lived on silence and purpose, feeding on the memory of Sarah's last breath. The police might have called it an accident, but Daniel knew better. Accidents don't come with cover-ups. By the end of that week, he knew the names of every officer involved in the raid. Sergeant Harris, who led the entry team. Officer Brandt, the man who fired the fatal shot. Lieutenant Sloan, who signed the wrong address. And the dispatcher, a rookie named Emma, who was told to forward the complaint from a concerned citizen. That citizen was Greg Wallace, the HOA president who had spent months harassing Daniel over the smallest things. It was Greg who complained about the generator, about the shed, about Daniel's refusal to follow community standards. His reports were petty, constant, and cruel, but the last one had consequences no one could have imagined. Daniel stood by the wall covered in photos, his eyes scanning each one. He had drawn connecting lines between faces, times, and decisions, mapping the path from Greg's phone call to the trigger that ended Sarah's life. Every red thread led to one conclusion. This wasn't just negligence, it was arrogance. A chain of men who never stopped to question what they were doing because they thought they couldn't be wrong. And that thought would destroy them. The first move came quietly. Late one night, Sergeant Harris received an anonymous email at his personal address. It contained a photo of his house, taken from the tree line behind his backyard. Beneath it were 2 words, "I see you." Harris panicked, calling the department, reporting that someone was stalking him. But by the time officers arrived, the camera that had taken the photo was already gone, and the trail was cold. No fingerprints, no trace. Harris didn't know it yet, but Daniel had been there hours before, watching from the shadows, memorizing every step, every reaction. It wasn't revenge yet. It was psychological warfare. Daniel didn't want to kill them. Not yet. He wanted them to feel what he had felt that night. To lose control. To wake up every minute with fear creeping into their bones. He wanted their guilt to eat them alive before he even touched them. 4 days, he watched them from a distance, following their routines with the precision of a man who had done this his entire life. He didn't need to break in. He didn't need to threaten them. All he needed was time. At the same time, he began leaving small pieces of truth where they couldn't be ignored. He sent the warrant documents to an independent journalist, someone he knew from years ago when he worked covert operations tied to international affairs. The journalist owed him a favor, and Daniel knew how to make sure the story got out. Within a day, headlines appeared across the city. Wrong door raid kills innocent woman. Police department under fire. The chief called it misinformation, but public pressure was building. Daniel watched it all unfold from his laptop, unmoved. The world thought the case would end with apologies, resignations, and maybe a few lawsuits. But Daniel had seen how these stories always ended, with nothing changing. He wasn't after policy. He was after justice. Real justice. One evening, while the city was still buzzing over the leaked story, Daniel drove to a storage facility 2 towns away. He walked down a dimly lit corridor, his boots echoing softly against the concrete. He stopped at Unit 47, entered a 6-digit code, and rolled up the door. Inside were old crates marked with military numbers, all covered with dust. He pulled one open. Inside lay the remnants of a different life: tactical gear, body armor, encrypted radios, and a folded black uniform. He ran his hand over the name tag on the chest. Turner, D. The weight of the fabric in his hand brought back the ghosts of 100 missions he'd tried to forget. The sound of gunfire, the smell of metal, the voices of men who never made it home. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This time, the mission wasn't for a country or a commander. It was for her. He packed the essentials into a duffel bag: gloves, wire cutters, a small camera drone, and a device that could intercept short-range police frequencies. Then he locked the unit again and drove back into the night. On his way home, he stopped by the lake that bordered his neighborhood. The same lake the HOA claimed to protect with strict rules and permits. Sarah used to love sitting by the water, sketching the ducks that came by in spring. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the reflection of the moon on the rippling surface. It was the same moon that had watched over her last breath. He whispered softly, "I'll fix this, Sarah. I promise." The next day, he paid a visit to Greg Wallace. The HOA president didn't recognize him at first when he opened the door. Daniel looked calm, polite, even friendly. He held a small stack of papers in his hand. "Greg," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to clear something up about that report you made a few weeks ago." Greg blinked, nervous but trying to keep his composure. Yeah, look, Daniel, it was nothing personal. Just, rules are rules, you know how it is." Daniel smiled faintly. "Of course, rules are important, especially when they decide who lives and who dies." Greg frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Daniel handed him one of the papers. It was a copy of the police complaint, the one with Greg's name on it. "You might want to read that," Daniel said quietly. "It's the last thing you ever signed before my wife was killed." Greg's face turned pale. "Wait, I didn't know. I didn't mean for," but Daniel stepped closer, and Greg froze. "I know," Daniel said softly. "That's the problem." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Greg trembling at the door. That night, Greg filed a police report claiming he was being threatened. But when officers checked the security footage from his home, the recording was blank. The cameras had stopped working for precisely 3 minutes, the exact amount of time Daniel had been on his porch. As days passed, small, strange things began happening to each man involved in the raid. Their phones would ring once at 2 a.m., showing no caller ID. Their home Wi-Fi networks would flicker on and off randomly. Some of them received letters with no return address, containing only photos, blurry, distant shots of their patrol cars, their homes, their families. The department called it harassment, but none of them could explain how whoever was behind it knew so much. Then came the real blow. The internal files of the police department leaked online. Names, radio logs, timestamps, even internal memos about the cover-up, all posted anonymously. The story exploded. News stations ran special reports. Protesters gathered outside the station demanding accountability. The city's mayor called an emergency meeting. But Daniel stayed in the shadows, watching. Every piece of chaos was a result of his quiet precision. He had learned long ago that revenge didn't need rage, it needed control. Detective Rowan came again, this time with 2 other officers. They wanted to question Daniel about the leaks, about the anonymous emails, about the reports of harassment. They expected to find an angry, broken man. Instead, they found calm. Daniel opened the door, invited them in, and poured coffee. His hands didn't shake. His voice didn't rise. He spoke like a man discussing the weather. "I read about the leaks," he said mildly. "Seems like someone inside your department wants the truth out." Rowan studied him carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Detective, I barely know how to use half the apps on my phone. You really think I could hack a police database?" Rowan didn't answer. He knew this man wasn't an ordinary homeowner. Everything about him, the posture, the focus, the calm under pressure, screamed military. But without proof, there was nothing they could do. They left empty-handed, but as they walked away, Rowan muttered to his partner, "He's not done. You can feel it." That night, Daniel sat alone in his darkened study, the glow of the computer screen lighting his face. He replayed the police radio frequency through his headphones, listening to the chatter. One voice stood out, Officer Brandt, the one who had fired the shot. His shift ended at 11 p.m., his route predictable, his habits consistent. Daniel noted every detail. He didn't want to kill him, but he needed him to understand. At exactly 11:45 p.m., Brandt's patrol car stopped at a diner on the edge of town. He got out, grabbed a coffee, and went inside. When he returned 10 minutes later, the car door was unlocked. On the passenger seat was a single photo of Sarah Turner, smiling by the lake, with a note that read, "You pulled the trigger. You finish what you started." Brandt froze, the color draining from his face. He looked around wildly, but the parking lot was empty. Daniel was already gone. The next morning, Brandt didn't report for duty. His partner found him sitting in his apartment, pale, trembling, unable to speak. The photo lay on the table beside him. Back in the Turner house, Daniel pinned the last photo to his wall, the officer's face marked with an X. He stood there in the dim light, staring at the wall of truth he had built. The reckoning had begun. One by one, the men who took his world apart would face their own. He wasn't doing this out of hate anymore. It wasn't rage that drove him. It was justice, pure and cold. The kind of justice no court could ever deliver. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Rain began to fall again, soft and steady. Daniel stepped to the window, watching as the storm gathered strength. His reflection stared back at him, calm, unbroken, unreadable. Behind him, the room was filled with shadows and the quiet hum of a computer downloading more files. The mission wasn't over. Not yet. But every storm begins with a single drop, and this one had just found its way home. The storm outside had grown heavier by the time Daniel realized how deep the rot truly went. Rain hammered against the windows of the small house, thunder rolling across the horizon like distant artillery fire. Lightning flashed for a second, illuminating the wall covered in notes, photographs, and maps, all threaded together by red string and Daniel's sharp handwriting. Every corner of that room now told a story. The story of how Sarah's death wasn't just the result of a bad address or a panicked officer, but something older, something buried under layers of bureaucracy, arrogance, and corruption. It began with one name circled in red ink: Greg Wallace, the HOA president. The man who called in the complaint that triggered everything. Daniel stared at that name for a long time, his jaw set, his eyes cold. He had already confronted Greg once, had seen the fear in the man's eyes, but fear wasn't enough. Greg had lied. Daniel knew it now. The initial call log he'd recovered from a whistleblower inside the department showed something disturbing. Greg hadn't just filed a complaint. He had forwarded an internal HOA incident report with photos of Daniel's backyard, describing his generator as possibly being used for illegal activity. The report was stamped and approved by someone from the city council, who had financial ties to the same construction company that had been fighting Daniel for a zoning permit on his land months ago. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a chain reaction of greed and negligence, each person passing the blame until someone innocent got caught in the middle. Sarah had died because people in power treated paperwork like a game. He turned away from the wall and sat at the table, his hands clasped tightly. The light flickered above him, casting his shadow long across the room. He wasn't angry in the way most men would be, shouting, breaking things, losing control. Daniel's anger was the kind that went silent, that sharpened with every breath. He was trained to observe, to analyze, to dismantle. And that's exactly what he was going to do. That night, he drove to the old HOA office, a brick building on the edge of the town square. The lights were off, the parking lot empty except for Greg's black SUV parked near the entrance. Daniel sat in his truck for a long moment, the rain blurring the windshield. He could see Greg's silhouette through the window. The man was still inside, maybe working late, maybe hiding. Daniel stepped out quietly, the rain soaking his jacket, his boots moving silently across the pavement. He didn't knock when he reached the door. He picked the lock with practiced ease, slipped inside, and closed it behind him. The building smelled like paper and coffee, sterile, unremarkable. But the walls were covered in photos of smiling neighbors, fake community pride, all hiding the corruption underneath. Daniel walked down the hallway, his steps soundless on the carpet, until he reached Greg's office. The door was half open, light spilling out from inside. Greg was hunched over his desk, typing nervously, his face lit by the glow of the computer. He looked older than before, his shoulders tense, eyes red, jaw tight. When Daniel pushed the door open, Greg jumped to his feet. Jesus, Daniel. What the hell? How did you even? Greg's voice broke when he saw the expression on Daniel's face. It wasn't rage. It wasn't madness. It was calm. Controlled. The kind of calm that made your stomach drop. Daniel walked in and closed the door behind him. You've been busy, he said quietly, glancing at the computer screen. On it was an email thread between Greg and a city official, discussing the Turner complaint. Daniel took a step closer, his eyes flicking to the name of the recipient. You forwarded it to the council. You said there was potential illegal construction. Why? Greg swallowed hard. It was procedure. You know how it works, every report goes through the board. Daniel interrupted softly. Don't lie to me, Greg. You signed off on that personally. You flagged it as urgent. You told them I was hiding something. What did you think I was doing in my own backyard? Greg's lip trembled. I didn't think they'd send the police. Look, you wouldn't listen. Daniel. You always acted like you were above the rules. I wanted them to check on your property. Maybe fine you, I didn't mean. Daniel took another step closer until he was inches from him. You didn't mean for them to kill her. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. But you did mean to make my life harder. You wanted to prove a point. You wanted to remind me who runs this neighborhood. Isn't that right? Greg's breath came fast now. Daniel, please, man, I'm sorry. I've been sick thinking about it. I didn't know what would happen. I swear. Daniel's eyes softened slightly, but only for a second. You didn't know because you didn't care. That's worse. He turned to the desk, looking over the papers scattered across it. Meeting minutes, permits, financial statements. But one document stood out. A list of upcoming development projects with signatures from city officials. One of them matched the name from the construction company. Daniel realized what it meant immediately. The HOA had been working with the developers to pressure certain homeowners to sell their land, his land included. His property was in the perfect location for expansion, right by the lake. The complaints, the warnings, the harassment, it was all part of a larger plan. Greg hadn't just been a petty neighbor. He was a pawn in a profitable scheme. Daniel's voice was low and cold when he spoke again. You weren't just filing complaints, Greg. You were working with them. You were trying to push us out. And when I didn't move, you found another way to make my life miserable. You called it in. You started it. Greg stepped back, his hands raised. Daniel, please. Daniel didn't move. He just stared at him, the rain outside roaring louder against the windows. Do you believe in accountability, Greg? He asked softly. I don't know what you. Daniel stepped closer until their faces were inches apart. You're about to learn. He didn't hit him. He didn't threaten him. He simply reached over to Greg's computer, pressed a few keys, and downloaded the email archive onto a small drive. Then he looked back at Greg. You're going to tell the truth, he said. All of it. The deals. The complaints. The calls. You're going to hand it to the press yourself. If you don't, the next thing they'll find is proof of what your company did with city money. Greg's face went pale. How do you know about that? Daniel's eyes flicked up. Because you were sloppy. You used the same password for everything. He turned and walked out, leaving Greg shaking, speechless. The rain swallowed the sound of his footsteps as he disappeared into the night. By the next morning, the news broke again. Another leak, this time, emails between HOA officials and developers, revealing kickbacks, forged permits, and cover-ups. The scandal exploded. Reporters swarmed the HOA office, demanding answers. Greg resigned publicly, claiming stress, but the damage was done. The entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers about corruption, greed, and the man who had started it all. No one mentioned Daniel by name, but everyone knew. That afternoon, Daniel sat in his study, watching the chaos unfold on his laptop. But beneath the satisfaction, something else troubled him. There were gaps in the timeline, missing data, deleted messages, encrypted attachments that led nowhere. Someone higher than Greg had been pulling strings. Someone with access to both the HOA and the police system. He traced the chain of communication back and found a familiar name in the city's database. Deputy Chief Raymond Sloan, the same man who had signed the raid warrant. The same man who now appeared in multiple developer meetings. It wasn't a mistake. It was a conspiracy built on greed, and Sarah's death was collateral damage. Daniel leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly. His fingers drummed on the desk, his mind already calculating his next move. Sloane wasn't some bureaucrat hiding behind papers. He was dangerous, connected, and protected. Taking him down would mean going deeper than Daniel had ever gone before, even in his military days. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced men like Sloane before, men who thought power made them untouchable. The storm outside quieted to a drizzle. The streets glistened under the soft glow of streetlights. Daniel stood by the window, watching the reflection of his own eyes in the glass. Eyes that no longer belonged to the quiet man who once fixed fences and brewed tea for his wife on Sunday mornings. They were the eyes of the man he used to be, the one they called Reaper One. He whispered to the empty room, "Now I know who you are." His voice was calm, but beneath it, something dark stirred. The reckoning that had begun with fear was now shifting into something far more deliberate. Daniel didn't just want revenge anymore. He wanted exposure. He wanted every lie, every bribe, every hidden thread of corruption to burn under the light of truth. And as lightning flashed once more over the lake outside, Daniel turned off the lights, opened his notebook, and wrote 3 words on the first clean page: Operation Reprisal begins. The night had grown darker than usual, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The storm had passed, but the air outside Daniel's house still smelled of rain and smoke, heavy with a kind of silence that didn't belong in peaceful neighborhoods. Inside, the only light came from his desk lamp, a dull, amber glow that flickered across the walls covered in maps and photographs. His face was calm, but behind that calmness was something else, something far more dangerous, a steady, controlled fire that burned without sound. It had been days since Greg's emails exposed the HOA scandal, and the city had erupted in outrage. Yet Daniel knew what the news didn't. The truth went deeper than property fraud and political bribes. It went into the core of the system that had broken into his house and ended Sarah's life. The next name on his list wasn't a local official. It was Deputy Chief Raymond Sloane, the man who had authorized the raid, then buried the evidence under bureaucratic excuses. Daniel leaned forward, scrolling through the files he'd gathered. Sloane's digital footprint was wide but careful. He'd served in law enforcement for over 20 years, known for his charm in public speeches and his firm stance on community enforcement. Behind closed doors, however, his name appeared on a dozen undeclared financial records connected to the same development companies working with the HOA. Daniel zoomed in on a photo from one of the charity events the chief had hosted. Sloane smiling with Greg Wallace beside him, shaking hands with a man in a gray suit. Daniel's eyes focused on the man in the suit. He didn't recognize him, but something about his posture, his watch, the way he kept his face turned slightly away, it felt military. Controlled. Trained. He ran a facial match through a database that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, an old encrypted network he'd once used during covert operations. Within minutes, the match appeared: Marcus Hale, former intelligence officer, discharged years ago for misconduct. Now working privately as a security consultant. Daniel exhaled slowly. Sloane wasn't working alone. Hale was the kind of man who handled the things that couldn't be written down. Threats, leverage, disappearances. If Hale was involved, then this wasn't just corruption, it was orchestration. Someone had directed the pieces from the shadows. And if Sloane was the puppet master, Hale was the hand that made everything move. Daniel stood and crossed the room, stopping at Sarah's picture on the mantel. Her smile in that photo, bright, warm, unguarded, hit him like a knife every time. He brushed his fingers against the glass. "They think this ends with words and apologies," he whispered. "They have no idea what's coming." His reflection in the frame didn't blink. That night, Daniel moved through the city like a ghost. He wore dark clothes, gloves, a cap low over his face. His movements were precise, efficient, without hesitation. He wasn't just wandering, he was following. Sloane's car, a sleek black sedan, was parked outside the downtown courthouse. Daniel waited across the street in the shadows, watching through a scope mounted discreetly on a small drone. The feed streamed directly to his phone. When Sloane emerged, he was laughing with 2 other men, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his uniform jacket slung casually over his arm. The sight of that easy laughter hit Daniel like poison, the laughter of a man untouched by guilt. Sloane got into his car, and Daniel followed from a distance. The streets were empty, just the hum of engines and the whisper of rain slicking against the pavement. When Sloane turned down a narrow road leading to a gated neighborhood, Daniel parked a block away. Through his binoculars, he saw the security guard wave Sloane through without checking his ID. Typical. Power never waits in line. But Daniel wasn't after the gate. He was after the system behind it. He waited until the night deepened, until every light in the surrounding homes flickered out. Then he moved. His old instincts guided him, the same muscle memory that had kept him alive in places far deadlier than this quiet suburb. He scaled the side fence, cut through the hedge, and reached the back of Sloane's property. The chief's house was massive, glass walls, marble floors, the kind of luxury money couldn't buy legally. Through the window, Daniel saw Sloane in his office, pouring himself another drink, talking on the phone. The words were muffled, but Daniel could read his lips. It's handled. The HOA leak's been contained. The department will take the blame, standard procedure. He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, then smirked. No, he's not a threat. He's just some washed-up veteran who lost his mind. We'll keep eyes on him. Daniel's hand tightened around the hilt of his knife, not out of rage, but focus. He wasn't going to kill Sloane tonight. Not yet. He wanted him to know he wasn't safe anymore. He moved silently around the side of the house, disabling the backyard camera with a short burst of static from his jammer. Then he picked the lock on the side door, entering the dark hallway like a shadow slipping through the walls. His boots made no sound on the tile. He stopped in the office doorway, watching the man who had taken everything from him. Sloane stood with his back turned, still talking. Daniel's eyes flicked to the desk, a half-empty glass of whiskey, files spread open, and on top of them, a single photograph that made his stomach turn. It was a crime scene photo, his house, the night of the raid. The caption read, "Closed case, civilian casualty." Daniel reached forward and picked it up silently. His reflection stared back at him from the glossy paper, a ghost haunting the evidence of his own tragedy. He placed it back exactly where it was and stepped backward into the shadows, unseen. As he left the house, he placed something small under the front step, a motion sensor camera that would record every face entering or leaving. He wasn't done yet. He was gathering proof. By morning, Daniel had what he needed. The footage from the night before showed Hale arriving at Sloane's home shortly after Daniel left. The two men shook hands, exchanged a briefcase, and went inside. That was all Daniel needed to confirm it. They were tied together. He uploaded the footage to a hidden drive and began writing his next message, this time not to a journalist, but directly to the mayor's office. The email was simple. The men you trust to protect your city are the ones who killed an innocent woman and buried the truth. You have 24 hours to release the internal reports before I do it for you. Attached were files, photos, timestamps, everything pointing straight to Sloane. That day, chaos rippled through the city again. The mayor denied the claims, the police department called the leaks fabricated, but the evidence was too detailed to ignore. Reporters demanded interviews, officers whispered in hallways, and Sloane held an emergency press conference to address the lies. But as he stood before the cameras, sweat glistening under the bright lights, Daniel watched from a nearby rooftop, camera in hand, recording everything. When Sloane stammered through his denial, Daniel noticed it. The flicker in his eyes, the tension in his jaw. Guilt always showed in the small movements. That night, Daniel returned to the lake, the same lake where Sarah used to sit on warm evenings, drawing sketches in her notebook. The moon was bright, the water calm, but his reflection looked nothing like the man she'd loved. He sat on the old bench, the cold wind brushing against his face. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let himself remember her laughter, her voice, her touch. The sound of her saying his name in that soft, teasing way. It all came back in waves that hurt more than any wound. He whispered into the night, "I'm still here, Sarah. I'll finish it. For you." The sound of his phone vibrating broke the silence. An unknown number. He answered, saying nothing. A familiar voice came through, low and steady. "Reaper 1, the voice said. "You've stirred up quite a storm." Daniel didn't move. "I told you, I'm not done." "I can see that," the voice replied. "You're making powerful enemies. Sloan isn't your only problem. Hale's people have noticed you. You're not invisible anymore." "I don't need to be invisible," Daniel said. "I just need to be faster." The voice paused. "Then you'll need help." "I don't trust anyone." "Then trust this," the voice said quietly. "There's another file, buried in Sloan's encrypted drive. It ties the HOA deal to a larger operation, one involving police funding, real estate kickbacks, and federal grants. Find that file, and you'll bring the whole house down." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the screen, then slipped the phone into his pocket. The storm was no longer outside. It was spreading inside the city itself, cracking through the walls of power that had once seemed unbreakable. By dawn, Sloan's mansion was crawling with reporters and officers. Someone had leaked another video, footage of him and Hale exchanging the briefcase. The public demanded answers. The mayor suspended Sloan pending investigation. But Daniel wasn't celebrating. He knew men like Sloan didn't fall easily. They clawed, lied, and burned others down to save themselves. He would have to finish what he started. Back in his house, Daniel loaded a new page on his screen. The folder name blinked in the corner, Reaper Protocol. Inside it were names, addresses, and coded instructions. Every contact he'd need to expose the rest. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and whispered to the empty room, "The storm's here now." Outside, thunder rolled once more, low and distant. Somewhere in the city, men were waking up to find their secrets unraveling. The storm that Daniel Turner had unleashed wasn't a burst of chaos. It was precision, patience, and purpose. He didn't need to destroy everything. He only needed to cut the right wires, and the whole system would collapse under its own lies. The city woke that morning to chaos, the kind that doesn't come from noise but from truth finally clawing its way into the light. News anchors spoke in rushed tones, their voices heavy with disbelief as they read the headlines flashing across every screen. Deputy chief suspended amid bribery and cover-up scandal. Cameras swarmed the police headquarters, reporters shouting questions that no one dared to answer. Cars lined the streets as citizens gathered in protest, waving signs demanding justice for the woman who had died in her own home. The same photo of Sarah Turner that Daniel had left on the officer's seat now appeared on every major channel. Her smile, soft, kind, unaware of the cruelty waiting for her, had become the face of a movement. But while the world argued and the media feasted, Daniel stayed silent. He wasn't interested in attention or politics. His mission had never been about noise. It was about truth. And the truth still wasn't complete. Daniel sat in his dimly lit study, the blinds drawn, the hum of his old computer filling the air. His face was illuminated by the cold glow of multiple monitors, each screen showing a different feed, one tracking the news, another following the police's internal communications, a third decrypting the files he'd stolen from Sloan's private drive. Hours earlier, he'd slipped into the department's main server using credentials lifted from a corrupted login cache. The files he found there weren't just about Sloan or Greg or the HOA. They pointed to something bigger, a network of city officials, developers, and law enforcement officers funneling money through fake community improvement projects. The same people who had called his home non-compliant had been laundering millions through the HOA system, masking corruption as progress. Sarah's death had simply exposed the crack in their foundation. The files were encrypted, layered with military-grade firewalls, but Daniel knew how to peel through them. His fingers moved across the keyboard with precision born from years of practice. The sound of keys clicking filled the silence like a heartbeat. Every few minutes, he would pause, adjust a command, and continue. When the final layer broke, the screen filled with rows of text, dates, and numbers. And there it was, the proof. Transfers of funds from development firms into law enforcement partnership accounts. Sloan's signature appeared again and again, alongside Hale's alias. But one name caught Daniel's attention more than the rest: Senator Harold Jennings, the state official responsible for approving the police funding grants. Daniel leaned back, staring at the screen. He remembered Jennings from the news, always smiling, always talking about community trust and integrity. The kind of man who could sell poison and call it medicine. Jennings wasn't just connected, he was the spine of the operation. Without him, the entire system would fall apart. Daniel's mind began to move faster now, fitting the pieces together like an intricate puzzle. Jennings funded the developers. The developers bribed the HOA and the police. The HOA targeted homeowners who resisted, labeling them non-compliant or suspicious. And when those people pushed back, the police made sure they were silenced. What happened to Sarah wasn't random. It was part of a cycle. One Daniel had just broken open. He turned off the monitors and stood slowly. The room was cold, filled with the quiet hum of electricity. On the wall beside him hung a single framed photograph. Daniel and Sarah at the lake, her arms around him, the sunlight glowing behind them. He stared at it for a long time, his chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. They used her death to protect their lies, he said softly. Not anymore. By nightfall, Daniel was gone. He moved through the city's backstreets, his steps silent, his focus unshakable. He wore dark clothing, gloves, and a small earpiece connected to his encrypted radio. The city's skyline glimmered ahead of him, tall buildings shimmering like glass towers of hypocrisy. Somewhere up there, in one of those high-rise offices, sat Senator Jennings, hosting a private meeting with developers and law enforcement leaders to address the situation. Daniel knew because he had intercepted the calendar invite hours ago. He parked a block away from the building and walked the rest of the way, blending with the crowd. The doorman didn't notice him slip through the side entrance, nor did the guard patrolling the lobby. He moved like a shadow through the stairwell, counting each floor by memory. When he reached the 24th floor, he stopped by the service door and pulled a small device from his pocket. It was a compact signal jammer, custom-built from spare parts and military equipment. He pressed the switch, and within seconds, the building's wireless systems went dark. Cameras froze mid-frame. Security feeds went silent. Inside the conference room, laughter echoed. Jennings sat at the head of the long table, a glass of wine in his hand, surrounded by Sloan, Hale, and two developers. Papers lay scattered across the table, reports, strategies, damage control plans. We'll spin it, Jennings was saying confidently. We'll call it a rogue officer's mistake, issue an apology, and move on. The public forgets fast. Sloan nodded, his voice tight. And the leak? We've traced the IPs, Hale said. All lead to dead ends. Whoever this Turner is, he's good, but not untouchable. Jennings smirked. Everyone's untouchable eventually. Daniel opened the door. The room went silent. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He stepped inside slowly, the soft sound of his boots echoing on the polished floor. The men froze, their eyes widening. Hale's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Daniel was faster. He held up a small flash drive between his fingers. Looking for this? He asked, his voice calm, low, and deadly. Sloane's face went pale. How did you? Daniel ignored him. He placed the flash drive on the table. That's everything, he said. Every transaction. Every document. Every lie you buried. It's already been copied. If I don't walk out of this building in the next 10 minutes, it goes public. Jennings tried to steady his voice. You think you can threaten us? You're a nobody. You're a grieving husband. You don't know what you're doing. Daniel's eyes met his, unblinking. I used to lead missions in countries you can't even find on a map. I've seen governments fall over less than what you've done here. So yes, Senator, I know exactly what I'm doing. Hale took a step forward, his tone mocking. You're not the first soldier to think he can fix the world, Turner. You'll die before you get the chance. Daniel tilted his head slightly. You already had your chance to kill me. You wasted it. For a moment, no one moved. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You murdered my wife in her own home. You called it a mistake. But the truth is, it was never about her. It was about power. You used the police like a weapon. You made men like Sloane believe they were untouchable. But every weapon eventually turns on its master. He pressed a button on his phone. Instantly, every screen in the room came to life. Security footage, financial logs, recorded conversations, and one image that made everyone freeze. Hale handing Sloane the briefcase. The same footage Daniel had captured nights earlier. The truth, undeniable and clear. You're finished, Daniel said. Jennings's face twisted in panic. You don't understand what you're doing. This will destroy the city. Daniel's expression didn't change. No, he said softly. It will cleanse it. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Hale lunged. Daniel moved faster than anyone in the room could see. He sidestepped, twisted Hale's arm, and slammed him into the wall with brutal precision. The man crumpled, gasping, as Daniel leaned close enough to whisper, "You shouldn't have come to my house." He turned back to the others. Jennings was shaking, his hands raised. You'll never get away with this," he stammered. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low. "You think I want to get away? I just want the truth to live longer than your lies." He picked up the flash drive, turned, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he looked over his shoulder one last time. "If any of you come near me again, I won't just leak your secrets. I'll end you the way you ended her, without hesitation." When he stepped out of the building, the city lights flickered as if the entire skyline knew what had just happened. The rain had started again, falling softly, washing the streets in a silver glow. Daniel walked through it without a word, the flash drive safe in his pocket. Behind him, sirens began to wail as someone triggered the alarm. But it was too late. The files had already been sent to multiple news outlets, copied to every encrypted server Daniel still had access to from his old life. Within hours, the world would see everything: the corruption, the money, the cover-ups, the lies. By dawn, the city was burning with truth. Sloane was arrested. Jennings resigned under investigation. Hale vanished, his last trace caught on an airport camera before disappearing completely. The governor announced a full federal probe. The HOA disbanded permanently, and the name Sarah Turner became a rallying cry for reform across the state. But Daniel didn't watch any of it. He stood at the edge of the lake, the one where Sarah used to draw, the one that now mirrored the golden light of the rising sun. The world had changed, but for him, it was too quiet. He knelt by the water's edge, placed the photo of her in the grass, and whispered, "It's done." His voice broke for the first time, a soft sound swallowed by the wind. He stayed there until the sun climbed higher, painting the world in light, and for the first time in months, he closed his eyes without seeing blood or fire, only her face, smiling the way she always did when she said everything would be all right. The morning air was cold and clean, the kind that carried the faint smell of rain and the distant hum of life beginning again. The lake was still, reflecting the sky like glass, broken only by the gentle ripples of wind that moved across the surface. Daniel Turner stood there at the edge of the water, the same place where he and Sarah had spent countless evenings watching the sunset together. The soft glow of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the clouds gold and pink. He could hear the birds waking, the faint chatter of life returning after the storm. But for him, the world had gone silent. He stood motionless, his coat damp from the mist, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The flash drive that had destroyed careers, toppled a city's corruption, and exposed the truth was gone, buried deep in a place where no one would ever find it. The world knew now. The city that had called his wife's death a mistake had been forced to face what it had become. Justice, the kind the law had refused to give, had finally found its way to the surface. And yet, as Daniel stood there, he felt no peace. Only emptiness. Because no matter how many men fell, no matter how many systems crumbled, nothing could bring Sarah back. The wind whispered through the reeds, brushing against his sleeve as he pulled a small wooden box from his pocket. It was old, smooth from years of use, the same one Sarah had once kept her sketches in. He opened it slowly. Inside lay a folded piece of paper and her wedding ring. A simple silver band with the smallest scratch near the edge, from the day they'd built their first home together. He traced his thumb across it gently, remembering how she had laughed when it happened, calling it a mark of real life. That was Sarah, finding beauty even in flaws, always seeing light where others saw darkness. He unfolded the paper, her handwriting still clear despite the smudges of time. "Don't forget who you are, Danny," it said. "You've spent your life protecting others. Just remember to let someone protect you, too." His throat tightened as he read it. He had failed at that. There had never been anyone else like her. No one who could pull him back from the darkness the way she did. And now the darkness was all he had left. He sat on the old wooden bench by the lake, the one they'd built together from scraps of driftwood years ago. It creaked softly under his weight. The sun climbed higher, its warmth touching his face. Somewhere across the water, a child laughed, the sound distant but clear. Life was moving on, as it always did, indifferent to pain, indifferent to memory. Daniel watched the ripples spread and fade, and for the first time, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, not in anger, not in purpose, but in surrender. The city behind him was changing. He had seen it on the drive here, officers being escorted out of the precinct, news crews outside City Hall, the mayor giving statements about reform and new beginnings. People who had once ignored injustice were now marching for it. Strangers carried signs with Sarah's name, her picture held high above the crowds. They called her the spark that woke the city. The irony wasn't lost on him. She had always wanted to help people. Even in death, she was still doing it. The world finally remembered her name, not as a victim, but as the reason truth mattered again. But Daniel had no place in that new world. He wasn't a hero, not in the way the reporters wanted to tell it. He wasn't the grieving husband turned avenger they painted on the news. He was just a man who had lost everything, who had burned his soul to light the truth for others. And now that truth had no more use for him. His purpose had been fulfilled, and with it, the last piece of him that still belonged to the world. A faint sound broke his thoughts, the soft crunch of footsteps behind him. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively brushing near his coat pocket before he stopped himself. A figure stood there, half hidden by the morning fog. It was Detective Rowan, the one who had come to his door all those weeks ago with pity in his eyes and questions he didn't want to ask. But the man standing before him now looked different. Tired, worn, and heavy with something like respect. Rowan didn't speak for a while. He just watched Daniel, his hands in his pockets, the wind tugging at his coat. "They're calling you a ghost," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "No one knows where you came from, what you did before all this. They say you vanished after the files hit the net." Daniel turned back toward the lake. "Maybe I did." Rowan stepped closer. "I read every document. Every file you leaked. What you did, it saved lives, Daniel. You exposed something that would have buried this city for decades." He paused, lowering his voice. "You didn't just avenge your wife. You changed everything." Daniel's lips twitched in a faint, sad smile. "Change doesn't bring her back." "No," Rowan said softly, "but maybe it stops it from happening to someone else." They stood in silence for a long time. The sun had risen fully now, turning the water into sheets of gold. A single duck drifted across the lake, leaving ripples that shimmered in its wake. Rowan sighed and looked down. "You know they'll come looking for you. The higher-ups, the feds, maybe even people from your past. What you did, it scared powerful men." "I'm used to that," Daniel replied quietly. Rowan nodded. "If you ever want to disappear for good, I know a few places. Off-grid. Remote. No questions asked." Daniel looked at him then, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, "but I've disappeared enough in my life." Rowan gave a small nod, sensing there was nothing more to say. He started to leave, but before he did, he looked back one last time. "For what it's worth," he said, "she'd be proud of you." Daniel didn't answer. He watched the detective's figure fade into the mist until he was gone. Then he sat for a long time, his hand resting on the wooden box beside him. Finally, he opened it once more, took out Sarah's ring, and held it up to the sunlight. It glimmered faintly, catching the morning light like a fragment of memory. He smiled, not with joy, but with peace. He stood, walked to the edge of the lake, and knelt. The water was cold against his fingers as he held the ring for one last moment. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered. His voice cracked, but there was strength in it, the strength of letting go. Then he let the ring fall. It sank slowly, the ripples spreading outward, fading into the calm. He watched until the last circle disappeared, until the water returned to perfect stillness. Then he turned away, walking up the narrow path through the trees. The wind rustled the branches above him, and the light broke through the leaves, falling across his face in golden streaks. For the first time since that night, he felt something close to calm. Not happiness. Not relief. Just silence, the kind that comes after a storm has done its work. By the time he reached the road, the fog had lifted. In the distance, the city's skyline shimmered under the rising sun, rebuilt but scarred, alive but changed. Daniel paused, looking back one last time toward the lake, the home, the life he had buried in the ashes of truth. Then he pulled the hood of his jacket up, his footsteps slow and steady, fading into the horizon. No one ever saw him again after that morning. Some said he left the country. Others whispered that he joined a private task force overseas. A few believed he stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, protecting the innocent from the same kind of corruption that had taken everything from him. But no one knew for sure. Years later, a small plaque appeared by the lake, right next to the old bench. It read simply, "In memory of Sarah Turner, and the man who made the world remember her name." The wind carried through the trees, gentle and soft, like a whisper across time. And in that quiet, as the lake shimmered beneath the morning sun, it almost sounded like her laughter, faint, distant, eternal.